way of dealing with an AJAX request. And what we're really talking about there is kind of those callback sequences. Instead of dealing with XML HTTP request object, kind of the new model starting in ES6 is to deal with a promise. And the way a promise would work, so I'm going to go ahead and have a new file here. The way a promise would work is I'm just going to start with a HTML page, and then I'll embed some JavaScript, and we'll kind of go from there. So starting with an HTML page, titling this promises, script tag. I'll just write some script here. The way a promise works is I can instantiate a variable that is a promise. Okay, so if I say I want to have a new variable, my promise is equal to a new promise, and that promise takes two arguments, a resolve and a reject argument. So those are both functions that are kind of self-explanatory. Like, what happens when this promise executes successfully, then it's resolved. I should execute it with some data. Versus, hey, this failed as a result of X, Y, and Z. I'm going to go ahead and reject the promise. Okay? So usually when you see a promise with a constructor, you get passed in this resolve, reject kind of sequence. And then assuming that things go okay, I would resolve or reject. Okay? We'll come back to actually defining our own promises, but this is what a promise object looks like. Okay? This is a little bit different in terms of how our programming ends up getting structured. So instead of creating our first promise and where we're going to resolve and reject, let's use the ES6 API to get a promise. Okay, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go out to Blackboard, and I want to deal with our weather project. Okay, so our weather project had an API where we'd go get latitude, longitude coordinates based on a zip code. So I want to do that same thing. So I'm just going to open up Blackboard, go get that link to the weather API. And that'll be under assignments, under projects. And here's our project where we're dealing with that weather API. So here's the postal code search. This is the API that I want to do my lookup based on the weather. So I'm going to have a variable that is my URL, right? And I obviously need to attach some parameters to that, right? So if I come out to my browser, I should be able to go out to that API, username, limit it based on the country code, and then I end up with my search in Verona. Or if I want the MATC weather, I use 53704. Okay, so I'm getting that Dane County weather. Okay, it has my latitude and longitude coordinates. Everyone's good with that result? Okay, so then how this integrates into our discussion about promises is, in the past, we'd use that XML HTTP request object to make a request. We get a response back, and then that response could be JSON or XML or text. Instead of that, what we're going to use is we're going to use a new method as part of the ES6 API, which is fetch. Okay, so I have this URL, so let's just make it a variable. And the variable that I want some information concatenated in. Right, so eventually I'm going to want the zip code concatenated in. I'm going to want the username concatenated in. So usernames being some variable. Right, so let const username equal to B. Witkowski. I'm going to set up my zip code as a constant because I don't have a user interface for my zip code. So my zip code is just going to be 53704. and then my country code. So it's just country. It's just going to be US. And then I want to concatenate all this onto my URL. So I'm going to use the username, and then I'm going to have my, I believe it's zip or zip code, I'm not positive, postal code. And I'll soft wrap this. Okay, and then one last code, which is my country. Okay, so that's my URL that I want to then fetch. This fetch returns a promise. So I'm just going to have a variable called zip code promise equal to the result of that fetch statement, and then we can do a console.log of my zip code promise. And I'm going to save that. I'm actually going to save it into, let me save it on my, eventually I'm going to want to make this request. So I'm going to create a new folder in my web server root directory. So I'm going out to my library, web server documents directory. I already have a directory called promises. I'm going to remove that. So sudo rm promises. I'm going to make that same directory because I want this to go into the promises directory. I just cleared everything. So I make that new directory, and then I'm going to change the permission on that promises directory so I don't have any problems writing to it. And now I should be able to just save to that directory any file that I want to create. So just changing the file extension there. Okay, so now if I come over to my developer tools, I should see in my console, if I actually go to that URL, so localhost/promises, you'll see I have this pending promise. You'll notice the promise status is it's resolved, this promise value, some response. Okay, and then I can kind of dig in. It's not exactly what we dealt with before. Okay, what's going to go on is there is some lag, just like there was some lag with your XML HTTP request object when I made an AJAX request. I can't immediately say, oh, I want to deal with the data that came back from the result of this fetch. I can't do that. What I can do is I can say, okay, after you've made this request and you have a result, then what should happen? Okay, so the syntax is going to look like this. We have that same concept of that time delay. I make the request, so I send the request saying, hey, go get me the data from this API. So that same thing happens. I get a promise back. The syntax for this will be, then what should happen? And I pass in a function. Okay? This is your callback. Then what? Okay, so here's where it's a little bit different. When I go fetch the results from an API and I get a promise back as a result, the then will occur as a result of my promise getting resolved. Remember, our promise is either going to get resolved or rejected. And only one of those things is going to occur. Like it either happened successfully and it's resolved, or it happened unsuccessfully and it's rejected. So it's a one and only one type of deal. So once I get this zip code promise back and we know that it's going to resolve successfully, then what should happen? Well, we're going to have a function definition here that's going to handle the results. So basically, I'm going to pass in some function definition, and I'll use kind of modern syntax. I'm going to get the results back. whatever the results happen to be. So ours is going to be like zip code results. And I'm going to map that into a function. I shouldn't use the term map, but I'm going to map that into a function. Okay, this fetch will return either plain text data or JSON data, or it could return a blob. So if I just do a quick Google search of a fetch API, and I'm looking at the response. The response, I could get an array buffer, I could get a blob, I could get form data, I could get JSON, I could get plain text. In our case, we're getting JSON back because that's what we requested. So this is a little bit strange. I can't assume that the results is going to be a JSON object. The results are results. Like, it's the response. So what I have to do is I have to say, hey, what I'm getting back, the results in this case, happens to be JSON. So I want to deal with it as JSON. I want to take the results and convert it to JSON. Okay? So I'm returning that. And the return statement will make sense here in a second. Okay, so I'm basically fetching data from a URL, from an API. When it comes back, then what? I'm saying, hey, the data came back, great. I really want to deal with it as JSON, so I convert it over to JSON data. That's what happened there. What should I do then? I have JSON data, now what should I do? And in the past, we'd convert it to JSON and continue working with it. This results.json also returns a promise. So I concatenate another then. Then what? Then I have JSON results, right? Now I come through and I say, hey, you know what I really want to do is just log those JSON results. Okay, that's the point when we can actually start working with that data.
Is it called JSON results? I mean, is that
That's not a keyword or anything like this. I could call it data and data as JSON. Yeah, it's completely arbitrary what I'm naming my variable here. Okay, and we can come back and fix it specifically for this zip code case, right? Because we're getting zip code data back. But when I now log this, so I initially logged my promise somewhere. Okay, so you'll notice that this is not sequential. It's still asynchronous. And I can tell that based on the way things logged out in my console.log messages. So if I'm reading this and I was reading it as a sequential-based application, what would happen is I'd see this console.log on line 23. I'd assume that those results show up first, and then on 26 I log the promise, but you'll see that that's not what's happening. I logged the promise, it says it was pending, and then I logged the results after. So sequentially I'm going back through here, but then when I do get the results back, then I execute this code that's in the then statements. Okay, and then you'll see that I have my postal code data. Okay, that's my JSON data that I care about. I don't know why I'm not getting my country code limited because I spelled country wrong. You can see I have two zip codes. One of them is not in the United States. It's because I spelled country wrong. So I'm going to fix that. And now if I refresh this, I should only have one item in my postal code. So it's the same data that I was getting before. It's just kind of modern syntax. Okay, so at this point, let's go ahead and rename some of these variables. So like this is going to be my zip search results. And that's what I want to convert to JSON, my zip search results. And then now I have my JSON zip search results, and I'm just logging those things. Well, the only things I really care about are the latitude and longitude in this case, right? So if I'm looking at this, I have a postal code at index 0, and then there's a latitude and longitude. So what I want to do is I want to filter this even further. I want to say, okay, based on those zip search results, I want the latitude and longitude. And the way I'm going to get that is I'm going to come back over here, and I'm going to say I want to return a new object that has latitude and longitude coordinates. So I want to return some object that has a latitude and a longitude. Okay, and the latitude and longitude I'm going to get back from these JSON zip search results. So JSON zip search results at index 0 dot lat and JSON zip search results dot or at index 0 dot long. And I lied a little bit. I can't go right into the array. I have to preface this with postal codes because they named the data. Postal codes at index 0 and 1. That's my return value. Let's try this one more time, right? I return this. So I'm returning that object. Is everyone good with me returning that object? And then immediately our answer is, let's go ahead and have a then there. Right? And then we just get latitude and longitude results. We'll send that into some function. And let's just console.log our latitude and longitude results. Everyone good with that? I'm going to get rid of the other console.logs. So whereas logging the promise, whereas logging our JSON data, the only log statement I have is right here where I want to log that new object that contains just the latitude and longitude. Okay, I go ahead and save it. I refresh the page. And now I have my latitude and longitude. So far, so good. It's not terribly different than XML HTTP requests, but it's a little bit different. Okay? And we don't see a ton of differences today because we're just talking about promises. When we start to talk about like asynchronous promises and where we use await and stuff like that, things will get a little bit different. But for now, they're not all that much unlike an XML HTTP request where we have a callback. Okay, so let's say things went wrong. So if I happen to have a typo, like I spelt search wrong. Okay, so now I end up getting an error. Uncaught in promise, type error, failed to fetch. So I have an uncaught error because my URL was wrong. I can handle that fairly easily. All I'm going to do is catch my error. Okay, so when I catch my error, what's going to end up happening is I get passed in the error object, and then I can execute a function based on the error that occurred. So I get an error that's passed in. It's going to get sent to some function where I can do a console.log error. Right, so I'm just logging the whole error. And now you'll notice, right now we have an uncaught exception. We have an uncaught promise type error. So I go ahead and run this. Now you'll notice I get this type error, failed to fetch. Like it's not uncaught anymore. I'm catching the error. Okay? I have the error object. Now what do I want to do with it? Is kind of, it's up to me. Okay? And I can also use that console.error. So you'll notice I get that same kind of error message. Okay, and that's because I have this typo in my API. So what we're seeing there is either the results of the promise getting resolved. We're going to go into the then statements, and we'll kind of chain those then statements together. or the result of that promise getting rejected because that API URL was invalid. Okay? So far, so good? Okay, so then I guess let's open up a new window. Okay, so for those of you that remember Project 2, which was the weather-related project, we did something like xhr dot open our zip code finder, right? And then we had our callback. We extracted the latitude and longitude, just like we did right now. We extract the latitude and longitude, and then based on that, we would then kind of make a follow-up request, xhr.open, where we would pass in our weather finder. And that weather finder was dependent on the latitude and longitude, right? So we'd send that information along. And I'm kind of just hacking syntax here. And by that I mean that this second xhr.open, where I'm going to the weather finder, I had a dependency of this latitude and longitude coordinate. So I'd make one request, and then I'd get into my callback, and in my callback, I'd make a second request after that first callback was completed, right? And we call that callback hell. And what I mean by that is basically I do this first open, I extract this stuff, then I do this second open, and I do my callback stuff, right? And then if I had additional stuff like, okay, based on the weather, you know, like here's my shopping recommendations. Go out to Amazon, and maybe I'm a third-party seller at Amazon or eBay or whatever. And then maybe I do another one and make another callback to say, oh, you know, based on this weather and based on these jackets, maybe I want additional data too. And I could just keep kind of going and going and going. And what ends up happening is your code looks like this, right? Where you're indented across the page. If this is true, if this is true, after this callback, after this callback, after this callback, then we can finally get to our answer. You did it for Project 2. I did it specifically for this reason, to kind of demo promises. Okay, so if we were looking at it, your Project 2 code kind of looked like this. So make your zip code request, wait for your zip code request to complete. Once your zip code request completes, extract the latitude and longitude, take that information, send it on for the next request, get the weather information. Okay, promises cleans that code up a lot. Okay, so promises are a result of that callback hell, where I have that indentation and like it's not a flattened structure of code. Okay, so what if I wanted to move this into a function? Okay, so I have this code where I'm getting the latitude and longitude, and if I've coded it correctly, I come back over here, I get my latitude and longitude. That's the data that I want. I'm sitting there waiting for it. What if I wanted that as a function? Could I do that? Okay, so if I go back to my XML HTTP request objects, I really couldn't do that. I couldn't have a return value in a function because my function, that return value, I would not have the data. And we kind of have a similar thing going on here. Right, so I'm sitting here. You'll notice that my promise output before I actually had results. So sequentially, what's going to happen is if I try to move this to a function, this code is going to execute sequentially, top to bottom. I'm going to hit the bottom of the function, which would be my return statement, before I ever have the latitude and longitude coordinates that I care about in my object. Since I'm not doing sequential programming, I have a problem with return values. And I had that same problem with XML HTTP request objects, right? That's why we had callbacks. That's why they're passed in line. Those callbacks, I didn't have return values in my callbacks because the return value would be null. I don't have the data back from my XHR request until after that callback executes.
Couldn't you put a return function in one of the then statements?
So I have a return function inside the then statements, right? And it's just going to go to the next then, and to the next then, and to the next then. So that's all happening asynchronously. Okay? So that's all happening asynchronously. So I run into a little bit of a problem, but promises solve that problem. Okay? So I want to have a return value. When I make this API request, I'm going to sit and wait on the results. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this into a function. Get lat and long, where I'm passed in a zip code. Right now I'm just going to ignore the zip code parameter because I hard-coded the zip code parameter, but life's good. So eventually I want this function, and instead of logging this promise, what I want to do is I want to return the latitude and longitude coordinates. So what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to do a console.log of get lat and long, passing in some zip code, 53593. Okay? And right now I'm ignoring this zip code that I passed in because I've hard-coded the 53704. It's pretty easy to replace, right? Like we just take out that constant and we use the zip code that's passed in. Okay, so everyone's okay with what we want to do? Okay, so I come back over to my browser, I refresh the page, I get undefined, but I also get the latitude and longitude. That has to do with the fact that I'm still logging it here. So you'll notice I'm getting undefined there. Everyone's good with that? It's undefined because I don't have an answer yet. Like I'm trying to access the results before I ever get the results. So like the logical step is, let's say I just return this. Right? We know that that's the object that we care about because we saw it. I just had it logged. Now I stopped logging it. I want to return it. I know that's the object that I actually want to return. So you'll notice it's still undefined. So nothing's changed there. I still have a problem. Okay? So far, so good? So what I want to do, though, is I want to sit and wait on this fetch. I want to make that sequential as opposed to asynchronous. Okay, I'll get another error. Await's only available inside of an async function. Right, I can't sit and wait if I don't make this function async, like if it's not marked async. Zip code promise is not a function. Uh-oh. If I await these search results, so let me just comment out the then statements, like all of the then statements. That looks okay, right? Looks good so far? Yep. So I'm not getting latitude and longitude, right? I'm getting my promise back. It's pending. Eventually I'm going to get my data. So then I'm trying to await these results, and then I'm trying to do my then. So let's kind of back up through all of it, right? Like we want to go step by step through all of this. Why am I getting then is not a function. I'm bothered by the fact that the then is not a function. I think I should have the promise back. I'm cheating here. I'm cheating because I just went through this over the weekend and so the only difference is I don't have it in a variable, right? So instead of loading this into a variable, let's try to handle this all with one.
Instead of await fetch row, would it be await input promise dot that? Would you just move your await keyword down too much?
Yeah, right.
Because I don't know if you're pulling that variable out, I don't know if the await's applying to the fetch. I'm wondering if it's probably just applying to that dot then.
Let's try. I think you're right, actually, because the fetch returns a promise immediately. There we go. Thank you. And so the reason I'm running into issues with this is I'm kind of going step by step and cheating through this. Usually I would make this all just one big statement. But as we go step by step, we'll refactor it kind of here at the end. So I'm waiting the then statement to get the search results. Then I want to take those search results and convert them over to JSON. So I'm returning that. And again, kind of step by step through this. Waiting for this data. And what I want to do is I want to actually create some variable that I'm going to then return. Right? So I'm going to have a variable called my coordinate results equal to the fact that I'm awaiting those coordinate results, which should be that object, this JSON object. And that's ultimately what I want to return. And then I can get rid of this console.log. Okay, so if I run this now, why am I not getting the return? I think I should have the results. Even though the dot then. Yeah, so what's happening is this return, I'm converting the resolved promise and then concatenating the dot then to say, hey, once you get that JSON result back from the promise, once that's been resolved, once you've taken the promise results, converted it over to JSON, then you get this data, then what should happen? So I'm treating that data, and now I just want to grab like the latitude and longitude out of there and return it. So that should ultimately be the end of things. Like that's the return value. So I think that's what the coordinate results are. So if I do a console.log of the coordinate results, you'll see that that's the right return value. I'm just not getting that. Okay, and here's the reason why, is I can't use it's hard to explain. I can't use a top level async and await. Okay, the only way I can do an async and await is if it's inside of an asynchronous function. Okay, so that doesn't necessarily make a ton of sense, but I can't use this asynchronous function outside of an asynchronous function, because I have to mark everything as async. So there's no such thing as a top level asynchronous request. Okay, so like I'll show you what I did for the example. So I'm just going to open that file. So you'll notice that I set up this event listener on click, go ahead and get the weather details. So instead of doing this asynchronous stuff as a top level function, I had to have a asynchronous function that allows me to await for the coordinates. Then once I got the coordinates back, then I could follow up and go get the weather. So I kind of have to do the same type of detail. Like, let me go back over to my index. Let's say I have and I want to do this using this async syntax. So I have an asynchronous function, and then that's where I want to log this information. Except I'm going to make this my coordinate details. And now, because I'm doing that, I should be able to just call my get coordinate details, and I think that that's the issue. And now you'll notice, why am I only getting that one log? So it's not working the way I'd expect. So this get latitude and longitude, I'm expecting to get the return value, which is these coordinate results. You can see the coordinate results are what I want. So when I log them inside the function, it works fine. I try to return them. Why am I not getting the results? I'm doing the same thing, it's just attached to an on-click event handler. There we go. because this is an asynchronous function, I have to await those results. Otherwise, I can't do anything. Okay? So, does this make any sense? Like, I know I've kind of hacked through this, right? Does it make sense to, like, go from an asynchronous environment over to a synchronous environment? Because that's essentially what we're doing. We're saying, hey, I know that JavaScript wants to be an asynchronous language, right? And things are going to happen in the background, and all of this stuff is going to happen. But I'm saying, I don't want that to happen. I want you to go get the zip code. Based on the zip code, I want you to go get the latitude and longitude. And then I'm going to sit and wait for you to do that. Like, I'm just going to block everything, wait for you to go get the coordinates based on this zip code. And I guess my question for you is not JavaScript, but does that make sense that I'd want to do that?
That seems to kind of defeat the purpose of having an asynchronous call.
Okay, so like my question is, does it make sense to sit and wait? And Robert's answer is that kind of defeats the whole purpose of this asynchronous call, right? And I'd agree. However, does it make sense that like I really need to do two things, right? Like I need to go get my coordinates, and then once I have the coordinates, I need to make another asynchronous call to go get the weather. And I can't really go get the weather until I have the coordinates.
That makes sense.
Right? So I'm kind of like stopped anyway. That's what we're talking about when we get into this callback hell. So asynchronously, it looks like, oh yeah, I'm making all my requests asynchronously, but the reality is I'm not making that second AJAX call, that second XML HTTP request call until that callback comes back with an answer. I'm waiting anyway to make that next request. Okay, I mean, in truth, it doesn't look like that. Programmatically, it doesn't look like that, and you're not being explicit about saying, hey, I'm waiting for this call before I execute this next callback. But that's what's happening. Like if you go look at your project 2, that's exactly what happened. Is I made the AJAX request, when the callback came, then I made another request. I was waiting, right? Like now we're being explicit about things. And I guess my question for you is, what code looks better? Right? So like if I look at my get weather details, like I go get my coordinate data, I go get my weather data, and I have it. Like this is what your project 2 ultimately ended up looking like. Like this is readable to me. It's sequential. Right? Okay, so let's kind of go back to our example here. Okay, so we get our coordinates. I waited on those coordinates, and that's going to allow me then to pass those coordinates over to my next request. Okay, so I want to have another function. I want to write it differently. Okay, so when I do, this is the syntax. I have my variable name equal to some asynchronous function. Okay, so I'm going to do that here. So I'll have const get weather info equal to some asynchronous function that takes in location information. And maps it to some function definition. Is everyone okay on that function syntax, that big arrow function syntax for an asynchronous function? So we have a variable called getWeatherInfo that's pointing at the function definition. So we want to do kind of the same thing here again, which is I want to await the result of this fetch where I'm going to have some weather URL. So here's my weather URL, and I'll have to go back to Blackboard to get that weather URL. So I'm going to fetch data based on the weather URL. The weather URL is going to contain my parameters, latitude and longitude. Right? So if I go back over to Blackboard, I have this find nearby weather. Okay, this is the URL that I want. Okay, and then I have to pass in some parameters again. So I'm going to use the string templating. I'm going to say that the username is equal to B. And my latitude's equal to some value, which is location.lat. And my longitude is equal to location.longe. And I got a typo here, not having the $sign in front of it. Closing backtick. Okay, now I want to chain those thens together because I want the weather information. So I fetch the results. I'm going to wait for that. I'm going to wait for the then to conclude. And Andy pointed this out, and this was the mistake that I was making before. I don't await this fetch. The fetch gives me an immediate result. Like, it gives me a promise. It just hasn't been resolved or rejected yet. So I get a promise back from that fetch immediately. I just don't have the data that I care about. So I'm not awaiting the fetch. I'm awaiting the fact that it's resolved or rejected. Okay, so then I'm going to get back some data. And what I want to do is I want to map that data to JSON again because I'm getting back JSON data. So I'm going to use some of the syntactic shortcuts. I'm going to get back data, and I'm going to map that data to data.json. And I don't have to have a return statement because it's a single line of code, so it'll have an implicit return. Is everyone okay with that? So really, I'm just returning the JSON expression, saying, hey, I got some data back from this promise that's been resolved. I want to convert that data that was just raw data. I want to convert it over to JSON. And then I'm going to do something else to it. Right? So then I'm going to take that JSON data and I'm going to map it to some object, right? So if I'm looking at that data, I think there's a couple of pieces of information, like, and we can test this out. But if I take this over to a URL, I probably have a shortcut for the response already, like the latitude being negative or 43 and the longitude being negative 89. Lat and longe parameters. Lat, longe. That looks right to me. I don't know that those are the right values. So latitude 43, longitude negative 89. That sure looks right, doesn't it? What is that? Oh, I don't have the equal sign. Yeah, I just didn't have the equal sign after the longe. So I just screwed that up. And the only reason I wanted to be able to see this is because I care about some of these things that are in here. Like, for instance, I care about the name, like the station name maybe, and actually I don't even care about the station name. Let's just assume that I want to get the weather, right? So I want to get the temperature, it's negative 2.2. I want to get the wind speed at 7. Okay, so the temperature and the wind speed is what I care about for this weather observation. Okay, so once I have that, I want to create some new object. Okay, my new object is going to be a JSON object. I care about the temperature being some value. And then I'm also going to care about the wind being some value. And the way I'm going to get those values, I'm going to go to the JSON data. I want to go to the weather observation. And then I care about the temperature. And then same for the wind speed. I want to go to the JSON data. I want the weather observation and the wind speed. Those are the only two things that I'm getting. And I'm just going to return all of this. Right here. Thank you. That's my return for my get weather info. Okay, so I get the coordinates for 53593, and then I want to say, here's my weather info equal to await get weather info. I'm going to pass in the coordinates, and then I should be able to log my weather info. Okay, so now I come back over to my promises. I refresh this. Looks like I'm getting different weather over in Verona, but it's close. Right, and maybe I want to convert that weather. Like in terms of temperature, I want the temperature to be times 5 divided by 9 plus 32. Right, and maybe I want to hook this up so that I have an input field, type equal to text, and ID equal to zip, and then a button, type equal to button, ID equal to get weather, probably want some kind of label for the zip code. So my user interface now has this type of look. This button, I just want to wire up to my, I don't necessarily like this get coordinate details name, but it's not the worst. I guess I can take that button. So I'm going to use document.query selector. I'm going to go get my zip code button, or it's called get weather. I'm going to say on click, so I'm going to add my event listener to click where I run this function. Which is this thing. And right now I have the get latitude and longitude hard-coded. I don't want that hard-coded. I'm going to go get the zip code value. So I'm going to have const zip equal to document.query selector zip dot value, and then I'm just going to pass in the zip. This is the method that runs when we click on that button. Add event listener of null. Query selector zip. Let's do this. Window.onload equals some function where I actually set up the event handler. I have it kind of screwed up because I wanted this all on a single page. So I just have the one HTML page. I don't have it linked to any JavaScript or anything like that. Not read, add event listener of. I did save it. Why can't I do this window.onload? Oh, my query selector is wrong. There we go. Okay, so now I punch in 53593. I get my weather for Verona. I try 90210 to get my weather for Beverly Hills. I get different coordinates. It's only 43 degrees in Beverly Hills. Is that right? Beverly Hills weather. It's not right. So why am I getting the wrong answer? It's probably my data conversion. It should be 9/5 plus 32. And I didn't notice the difference because we were so close to 0 on the Celsius temperatures here. So now I come back over, I get my weather for 90210, and I didn't refresh the page, so let me refresh the page. That looks better, 68 degrees. I get my Verona weather, it's 29 degrees. Why are we living here? Okay, so the upside of all of these promises, so, and I guess I probably didn't make a very compelling argument as I was trying to work through some of the bugs, but the compelling argument is that when I do a fetch, I'm returned a promise. Something's going to happen. I'm either going to get results back or I'm going to get an error. I'm either going to resolve that promise or I'm going to reject the promise. So right away I get an object that I can then pass around. If I want to handle it asynchronously, the way I would handle that, the callback becomes the then statement. Okay, we're used to callbacks. So our callback is that then statement. However, in our specific case, we get into that callback hell. That's the term. Like if I do a lookup, JavaScript callback hell. Right? So like there's all sorts of stuff about this. It's like we can keep going and going and going. Like so it's kind of as you get indented in your application. Like that should tell you you're doing something wrong. Like I'm sitting waiting on that. And then I'm going to wait on something else. And then I'm going to wait on something else. And then it fails and uh-oh, what happens? Okay, then you're screwed. You don't necessarily know where that happened. Okay, so I don't know what this is actually telling you, but so it's saying, you know, keep your code shallow. The way you keep your code shallow is with promises. And promises allow you to use this async and await in conjunction with one another so that I can wait on the response, so that I can have return values from my functions. Like I really do need to sit and wait on the location information before I can turn around to get the weather information. I can't just go get the weather information. It doesn't make sense. When I click on this button, you told me a zip code, but I can't get you the weather from the zip code. That's not possible. I need to go get you the latitude, longitude coordinates first. And now, the way I've written it, maybe I have some other application where I need to translate zip codes to latitude, longitude coordinates, unrelated to this. Right? So for this example, I needed to translate zip codes to latitude, longitude coordinates. Well, now I can have a function that returns that information. I just have a function that's going to get me the latitude and longitude coordinates based on a zip. And I can just make a call to that, and I can get the return value. So now it's separated out from that whole mess of APIs, right? Like if I want weather and I have coordinates, I can go directly to that. Right? So for example, I might want to do a console.log of get weather info, passing in some other coordinates, 10 and 10. Well, my coordinates, the way it's expecting those coordinates is with latitude label and longitude label. I have no idea where on earth this is. And what is going on here? Oh, I don't see that until I actually click on the... Looks like it's 84 degrees.
Yeah, but it used latitude 33 and longitude -95.
It didn't, so I'm logging these coordinates.
Oh,
Yeah, that's from previous information, right? So I guess to make this a more palatable example, if we go back to somewhere I had the results, like this nearby weather, there's the station name. So I'm just going to grab the location information. I'm going to include that as part of my weather results. So like when I get the weather, right now I'm returning the temperature and the wind. I'm also going to return the location. So JSON data dot weather observation dot station name. That's the best location information that I have. So now when I come back over here and I say, okay, get me the weather for 53593. I don't know where Gombe is. But it thought Verona was Middleton. That's fine. If I use 90210, gives me Santa Monica and Gombe. I guess as we get closer and closer to the equator, we get warmer and warmer, right? Apparently it didn't like that coordinate 0, 0. I have no idea. Like, I'm sure they're latitude, longitude coordinates, right? Yeah, 0, 0 is probably valid, but it must not have returned a location where I could get a temperature. Well, I'm sure it's warm there. We should be able to get a temperature reading. Okay. I would argue that promises are very similar to XML HTTP requests. They're just different. And what you'll see is that older applications have, and when I talk about older applications, I'm talking about like Node.js applications. Older applications will implement callbacks where I have to send in a callback. Newer ones will implement it with promises. Like, hey, I'll promise to get you what you need. I'll give you some response, either good or bad. I'll either resolve it or I'll reject it. Okay? We're going to spend some more time on promises. So like if you're like, this is the first time you're seeing it and you're like, oh no, I don't get that, and Brian screwed it up and the syntax was screwed up, it's fine. We'll come back to promises. So promises today, kind of an introduction to like where they're going to be used, but then we'll spend some time like how do we write our own promise? How do we resolve promises? How do we reject promises? So like if we were going to create a Node.js API where we wanted to return our own promise, how would we do that? Okay. I kind of warned you ahead of time today would be worse than Wednesday. So spreads are easy. That's kind of where we're going is. So we'll deal with promises, we'll deal with spreads, and then we'll come back to promises. Okay, so tonight by midnight, I told the online students I'd have project 4 ready. So I'll have it ready for you too by midnight tonight. And then on Wednesday, you'll have your next lab, which will be on promises. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to stop there for today and